The day I realized I was about to lose everything, the olive trees stood perfectly still, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I was 29 years old, standing in the middle of Hartwood Estate, hundreds of acres of ancient olive groves, stretching across the Soma Valley of Northern California, and none of it truly felt like it belonged to me. My name is Nathaniel Hart. I own Heartwood on paper, but the truth is I've been living under its shadow my entire life. My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. One moment, I had a family. The next, I had a mansion full of echoes, barns filled with machinery I didn't understand yet, and a will that felt more like a trap than a gift. The condition was cruel in its simplicity. If I didn't marry and have a legitimate child by the time I turned 30, the entire estate would pass to my aunt and uncle Benedict and Gertrude Hart. They were already waiting for that day. They circled like vultures for years. Phone calls from lawyers, surprise visits, thin smiles hiding hunger. They wanted to sell Heartwood to some massive winery and turn generations of olive farming into luxury tasting rooms and hotel suites. To them, this land was money. To me, it was the last piece of my parents. As my 30th birthday crept closer, I stopped going into town. I stayed on the estate, wandering between groves, pretending the quiet was peace instead of fear. The farm ran itself mostly. Harlan, my gruff manager, had been here longer than I had. The workers knew their jobs. I just drifted through my days, tasting oil, checking machines, trying not to think about the ticking clock. That afternoon in late June, the heat was relentless. The air shimmered above the gravel driveway. I had just finished inspecting the pressing machines in the main barn when raised voices carried from the front gate. Not angry, just tense. I wiped sweat from my forehead and walked toward the sound. Harlan stood at the wrought iron gates, arms crossed, facing a young woman I had never seen before. She looked like she'd been through too much already. Her brown hair was tangled and damp. Her jacket was soaked, clinging to her thin frame despite the heat. Faded jeans, worn sneakers. Her face was pale, shadows under her eyes telling a story of exhaustion and hunger. "Please," she said, her voice steady but desperate. "I just need work, cleaning, gardening, anything. I'll work hard, I promise." Harlan shook his head. "We ain't hiring. This is private property. Best you move along before I call the sheriff." She didn't flinch. She just stood there, shoulders squared, dignity intact, even as everything else seemed stripped away. Then something happened across the road. Mrs. Evelyn Porter, one of our regular buyers, was crossing with her cane when her foot slipped on the wet pavement. She fell hard, her cry sharp and sudden. Before anyone else moved, the stranger ran. She crossed the road without hesitation, dropped to her knees in the mud, and helped Mrs. Evelyn up with careful strength. She brushed dirt from her coat, guided her to the curb, and checked her face. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently. "Do you need help?" Quote. "Mrs. Kwon," Evelyn looked up at her like she'd seen an angel. "I'm fine, dear. Just shaken, thank you." I stood frozen, watching. This woman had nothing, and still gave everything in that moment. When she looked up, our eyes met. Hers were clear, strong, unflinching. "Harlan," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "That's enough." He turned, surprised. I walked forward and opened the gate myself. "Come inside," I said to her. "You look like you could use a break." She hesitated, glancing back at Mrs. Evelyn, who nodded encouragement. Then she followed me up the driveway, cautious but hopeful. On the shaded porch, I brought her a towel and a mug of warm milk. Simple things, human things. "Thank you," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I really just need work." "Why here?" I asked. "My mother's in the hospital in San Jose," she said quietly. "Cancer. I lost my job when I had to care for her. I walked and hitchhiked for 2 days to get here." No self-pity, just truth. "All right," I said. "We'll give you a trial. Room and board. Fair pay." Quote. Tears filled her eyes, but she held them back. "You won't regret it." Quote. As she walked back down the drive, I didn't know yet that everything in my life had just shifted. I only knew that the curse of Heartwood had just met someone who didn't know how to quit. I expected hesitation, maybe fear, but she moved through Heartwood like someone who had already decided she would survive here. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been touched in years, organized the pantry, helped Mrs. Martha in the kitchen, and even patched a broken fence when one of the workers didn't show up. She worked quietly, steadily, never asking for praise. By the end of the first week, the house felt different. The air smelled like fresh bread instead of dust. The dogs followed her everywhere. Even Harlan stopped grumbling. "Girls got grit," he muttered one afternoon. And from him, that was respect. I kept my distance at first. I watched from the edges while handling paperwork, oil samples, and buyer calls. But Rose changed the rhythm of the estate without trying. She noticed small things I had ignored for years: broken hinges, missing inventory, waste in the ledgers. One evening, she knocked on my study door holding a notebook. "You're being overcharged by one supplier," she said simply. "And this rotation schedule wastes labor hours." Quote, she wasn't guessing, she was right. Within weeks, expenses dropped, output increased, the workers trusted her. Hartwood began to breathe again. She never spent money on herself. Every paycheck went straight to San Jose. Hospital bills, treatments, medication. She wore the same faded clothes and never complained. That kind of strength does something to a man. Slowly, conversations shifted from work to life, from silence to shared coffee on the porch. She told me about growing up poor, about learning early, that no one saves you unless you fight for it. I told her about losing my parents, about growing up surrounded by land, but starving for warmth. Still, we stayed careful, separate rooms, separate lives, until my aunts arrived. They came with their lawyer like clockwork, polite smiles, sharp eyes, papers laid across my coffee table like weapons. "You're running out of time, Nathaniel," Gertrude said softly. 30 is close." Benedict leaned back smugly. "No wife, no child. Sign now and spare yourself the humiliation." That night, I didn't sleep. I walked the halls until dawn, staring at portraits of my parents, feeling like I had already failed them. The truth was brutal. I had no prospects, no time, no options, except one. The next afternoon, I asked Rose to meet me in my study. She sat across from my desk, hands folded, calm as ever. "I need to be honest," I said. "If I don't marry and have a child by my 30th birthday, I lose everything. This estate, my home." Quote. She listened without interrupting. "I can't fix this the normal way," I continued, "so I'm offering you a deal." Quote. Her eyes didn't widen, they sharpened. "A legal marriage," I said. "A child. In return, I'll cover all your mother's medical care forever, and if this arrangement ever ends, you'll be financially secure." Silence filled the room. Finally she spoke. "You're asking me to save your life with my body." "Yes," I said, "and I won't lie about that." She stood slowly, walked to the window, looked out at the groves. "When my mother gets better," she said, "I leave." "That's fair, and I don't belong to you." "You never would." Quote. She turned back to me, eyes steady. "I'll do it," she said, "but on my condition." I waited. "This won't be just a contract," she said. "I will protect this estate like it's mine. I will work, I will decide things with you. And if a child comes from this, that child is never a tool, never leverage." I swallowed. I agree. That was how it began. Not with romance, not with love, but with two desperate people choosing to stand together instead of falling alone. And neither of us understood yet how much that choice would cost us. No guests, no flowers, no music, just signatures, 2 witnesses, and a clerk who looked bored enough to miss the weight of what we were doing. Rose wore a plain dress. I wore the same shirt I worked in most days. When the clerk declared us husband and wife, Rose looked at me and offered her hand. "Partners," she said. "Partners," I replied. It felt like sealing a business deal, not starting a life. Back at Heartwood, nothing changed on the surface. Rose moved into a guest room down the hall from mine. We ate separately most nights. When we spoke, it was practical. Doctor appointments, schedules, timing, everything measured and careful. But beneath that structure, something else was growing. Rose threw herself into the estate like it was hers by blood. She reorganized the books, uncovered theft by the old bookkeeper, renegotiated contracts, and fixed inefficiencies I hadn't even known existed. Profits rose, waste disappeared. The workers stopped whispering and started listening. They didn't see her as my wife, they saw her as their leader. At night I'd find her still awake in the study, glasses perched on her nose, ledgers spread across the desk. She never asked for praise, never slowed down. She was building something, and I realized it wasn't just Heartwood. Still, the thing we needed most didn't come. Month after month, the doctor said the same thing. Be patient. Stress matters. Time helps. Time was the one thing I didn't have. My birthday crept closer. The letters from my aunt and uncle turned uglier. Phone calls came late at night. Threats wrapped in fake concern. Rose noticed. She always noticed. One evening she found me sitting alone on the porch, staring into the dark. "We'll be okay," she said quietly. I wanted to believe her. I started preparing for failure in secret. Sold off a small piece of unused land. Moved money into accounts only Rose could access. Made plans so she and her mother would never suffer if Heartwood was taken. The thought of losing the estate hurt. The thought of losing her hurt worse. Somewhere between shared coffee and late-night talks, the lines blurred. We laughed sometimes. She leaned her head on my shoulder without thinking. I caught myself watching the way she moved through the house, steady and sure. This wasn't part of the deal. The night before my 30th birthday, I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet. The olive trees whispered outside the windows. I wondered if this was the last night I'd ever call this place home. Morning came too fast. Benedict and Gertrude arrived before noon with their lawyer, confident and prepared. Papers spread across the table, smiles sharpened. "No air," Benedict said. "Sign and be done." Quote. My hand hovered over the pen. Then the door opened. Rose stood there, pale and shaking, one hand pressed to her stomach. "Don't sign," she said. The room froze. "I'm pregnant." The words landed like thunder, my aunt gasped. Benedict laughed in disbelief. The lawyer flipped pages, already calculating. Mrs. Martha stepped forward from the hallway. "I've seen the signs for weeks," she said firmly. Benedict shouted. Gertrude accused. But none of it mattered. I crossed the room and took Rose's hand. "You sure?" I whispered. She nodded, tears finally falling. "I wanted to protect you." For the first time in my life, I didn't feel alone. The lawyer confirmed it. The estate was safe, pending verification. My aunt and uncle left furious and defeated. When the door closed behind them, Rose nearly collapsed. I caught her. And in that moment, the deal ended. Because this wasn't about saving land anymore. It was about protecting the woman carrying my child. The house felt different after they left. Not quieter, not calmer, just real. Rose sat on the sofa, her face pale, breathing slow and careful. I knelt in front of her, afraid to touch her and unable not to. When I placed my hand over hers, then gently over her stomach, something inside me broke open. "I was scared," she said softly. Scared it wouldn't last. Scared of hoping. I nodded, my throat tight. "You saved everything." She shook her head. "I didn't do this for the land, Nathaniel. I did it because somewhere along the way this stopped being a deal." Quote, Rose's pregnancy wasn't easy. She tired quickly. Some mornings barely able to leave the bed, but she never lost her quiet strength. I went with her to every appointment, sat beside her in waiting rooms, learned how to make ginger tea for her nausea, learned how to listen instead of fixing. The estate flourished under her care. The workers respected her. The house filled with warmth. Laughter replaced echoes. Even the dog seemed gentler, always lying near her feet. At night, we sat on the porch talking about the future. Not contracts, not wills, real things. A child running through the olive groves. A home built on choice, not fear. When our son was born in early spring, the olive trees were in bloom. I held him in my arms, small and perfect, and felt the last shadow of the curse disappear. We named him Elias, Heartwood was no longer something I was fighting to keep. It was something we were living in together. What began as desperation became love. Rose had given me more than I could have imagined. And it wasn't just Elias. It was the way she loved this land, the way she breathed life into everything she touched, the way she made the estate feel like home, not just to her, but to me too. She had transformed Heartwood from a place I feared losing into a place I wanted to fight for, not because of the will, but because of the life we had started building. As the months passed, the estate became a reflection of us, stronger, healthier, and more united. Rose and I spent less time in separate rooms, and more time in shared spaces, talking about everything and nothing. She would bring me oil samples to taste, always asking for my thoughts, but always trusting her own instincts first, and I began to trust hers. The workers looked to her as their leader, and I couldn't deny that, in many ways, she was the one holding everything together. She would give orders, advice, and encouragement, and they followed her without hesitation. It was clear that this was no longer just my estate. It was ours. But even with all the progress, there was still one more thing hanging over us, my 30th birthday. The deadline. The looming reminder of everything I stood to lose. I had avoided thinking about it for months, convincing myself that I had time. But now, with Elias in my arms and Rose at my side, I knew that the day was fast approaching. And as the clock ticked down, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen to us if the deal was ever called in. One evening, as the sun set over the groves, Rose and I sat on the porch, Elias asleep in her arms. She looked at me, a calm smile on her face, but there was something in her eyes. A question. A fear. "You've given me everything," I said quietly, breaking the silence. "Heartwood. Elias. Your heart." She shook her head gently. "No, Nathaniel, we've given each other everything." The truth of it hit me like a wave. We had started this journey from a place of necessity, but somewhere along the way we had found something real, something unbreakable. "I'll fight for you," I whispered. "I'll fight for us. I'll never let this go." Quote. Rose smiled, and for the first time in a long while I knew she believed me. "I know," she whispered back. "I know." The estate flourished under Rose's care, and I found myself rediscovering my place in it. The mornings no longer felt heavy with dread. The nights no longer haunted me with the fear of losing everything. We were building a life, not just for ourselves, but for Elias and for Heartwood. Rose's strength had become the bedrock of our world. I watched her juggle her roles, wife, mother, leader of the estate, with a grace that still took my breath away. The workers came to trust her completely, and in turn, I learned to trust her even more. Each day, she gave more of herself to Heartwood, always taking one step further, always looking for ways to improve what was already good. I found myself looking at her differently. It wasn't just admiration. It was a deep, abiding love that grew with every moment we shared, every conversation, every quiet gesture. There were still no grand declarations, no romantic moments that the world could see, but there was a steady, silent promise between us. A promise that this was real, that what we had, what we were building, would last. As spring turned to summer, I couldn't deny the weight of the deadline looming ahead. My 30th birthday was just around the corner. I had already secured the estate, but my aunt and uncle would not give up so easily. They would fight, and it would be a battle one way or another. The night before my 30th birthday, I sat at my desk, papers scattered in front of me, unable to focus. The clock on the wall ticked louder with each passing second. I could feel the weight of the world bearing down on me, the final hour before everything would be decided. Rose came into the room quietly, her presence soothing. She stood beside me, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly, her voice steady but carrying an edge of concern. I looked up at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes, but also the strength that had gotten us this far. The truth was, I had never regretted it, not even once. Not the decision to ask her to marry me, not the choice to protect Heartwood, not the life we had built together. "No," I said quietly, "I don't regret it, not at all." She smiled softly, a quiet understanding passing between us. "You've given me everything," she whispered, her hand still resting on my shoulder. "And I've given you everything in return." I stood up and turned to face her. The silence stretched between us, thick with the weight of everything we had gone through, everything we had built. "I never thought this would happen," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought I'd have this. You, Elias, Hartwood. I thought I was going to lose it all." "You didn't lose it," Rose said, her voice firm and sure. "You found something more important. You found me. And I found you." I pulled her into my arms, holding her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath against my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt the certainty of our future. The ticking clock no longer sounded like a threat. It felt like a promise. The next morning, I woke up to the soft light of dawn streaming through the windows. Rose was already up, sitting by the window, Elias cradled in her arms. "Happy birthday, Nathaniel," she said softly, looking up at me with that same quiet strength in her eyes. "Today is yours, no matter what happens." I walked over to her, kneeling beside her, and kissed her forehead. In that moment, I realized that I had already won, not because I had secured the estate, but because I had secured something far more valuable: love, family, and a life worth fighting for. The morning of my 30th birthday arrived quietly, the sun casting a warm glow over the groves, as if the land itself was holding its breath. I stood by the window, staring out at the olive trees, feeling a mix of peace and anticipation. Today, the battle would be fought, not with papers and signatures, but with the promise we had made to each other. Heartwood was no longer just a piece of land, a legal contract, or a burden I had inherited. It was our home, a place built not on ownership, but on love. Rose walked into the room with Elias in her arms. She was as calm as ever, but there was a softness in her eyes that spoke of everything we had endured together. She handed Elias to me, her touch lingering just a moment longer than usual. "Today is our day," she said, her voice steady. I looked down at our son, his small hands clutching at my shirt. He had changed everything. The thought of losing him, of losing this family, was a fear I could no longer bear. But as I looked at Rose, I knew that no matter what happened, we had already won. We had built something that couldn't be taken away. At noon, Benedict and Gertrude arrived, as expected. They were dressed in their usual polished suits, smiles sharp and rehearsed. Their lawyer stood beside them, papers in hand, ready to fight for what they thought was rightfully theirs. They walked into the study, confident as ever, but this time it was different. Rose was there beside me, her presence grounding me, making me stronger than I had ever been. We didn't need to say anything. They could see it in our eyes. The deal was done. "You're late," I said calmly as they took their seats. Benedict shot me a cold glance. "You don't have much time left, Nathaniel." "I know," I replied, "but the estate is safe." Gertrude's eyes narrowed. "You think you can stop us? You've failed, Nathaniel." Rose stood beside me, her voice clear and unwavering. "This estate isn't yours to take, not anymore." Quote, "The lawyer tried to intervene, but Rose cut him off. Everything you've planned has already failed. This is our home now. You don't have a place here anymore." The room was thick with tension, but I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. This wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for Rose, for Elias, for Heartwood. The curse had been broken. Benedict and Gertrude exchanged looks, their anger simmering just below the surface. But there was nothing they could do now. It was over. "Leave," I said, my voice firm. "It's time for you to go." Quote. With a final, bitter glare, they stood up, gathering their papers and storming out of the room. The door slammed behind them, and for the first time in years, Heartwood felt completely ours. The weight of the past had lifted, and with it, the shadow that had hung over us. Rose turned to me, her face pale but full of strength. I reached out for her hand, and she gripped mine tightly, the bond between us undeniable. "Today," I said softly, "we start again." She smiled, the fear and doubt from the past months finally melting away. "Together." I looked down at Elias, asleep in my arms, and realized that this was what we had been fighting for. This was what we had built together, and it was worth every sacrifice, every struggle. Heartwood was no longer a place to be fought over. It was a home, a family. Our family. The olive trees swayed gently in the breeze outside, their branches heavy with fruit. The land had endured, and so had we. As I kissed Rose gently on the forehead, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. And that was the greatest victory of all.